Welcome to the Enneagram 2.0 podcast. I am Beatrice Chestnut.
And I'm Uranio Paes.
Today, we're talking about the passions and the virtues associated with the Enneagram system and how to use them for self-development, basically how to move from being consumed by the passion to embodying the higher virtue. Uranio, can you help us understand what the passions are? Define the passions and for us to start off with.
Okay, so I think that you and I agree that the passion is one of the key components of our psyche, and more specifically, the lower side of ourselves, which we call personality. The passion is central to what Gurdjieff called the lower emotional center, meaning it's the basic emotional tone, heart state, and also the basic emotion itself that each of us carry along with us everywhere we go. And it's almost ever present. Passion here means that we are controlled by it. We don't control it. It controls us. And this is why we call it a passion. And although we have traits of all 9 emotions, that happens only with one of them. And this is why we call that our passion. And this is why you and me believe that we need to concentrate a lot on our own type instead of looking at 2 or 3 different points of the Enneagram to define who we are.
Yes, the passion can be difficult to understand. Already in what you're saying in your definition, you mentioned that this is an emotion. Well, it's interesting because I think when I think of an emotion, I think of fear or sadness or anger, disappointment. But these are, pride and anger and fear, of course, but gluttony and lust and sloth or laziness. So they're a little bit more complicated, I think, than what we think of as average everyday emotions. Now, I think it's really important to realize that when we're talking about the passion, it can sound like something good, right? Like I feel strongly about something. But the passion in our Enneagram type that drives us as a central motivating factor that is often really unconscious, it's almost more like the meaning of passion in the phrase crime of passion. It's like you're overcome by something. It's compulsive. And again, often you don't realize that you are being driven by this very compulsive emotion.
Yes, this way I like to see it as a straight jacket that we all have, and also the passion of our type is a very key source of suffering. In the beginning, we don't know how much we suffer because of it. And it takes self-observation first and then emotional work on the passion to be able to see how much we suffer because of it. And this is why I also like to associate the term passion here on the Enneagram with passion as in passion of Christ. The suffering of Christ in all his process towards the end of his life.
And the original root meaning of the word passion is to suffer. And I think there have been people lately who have quite correctly noted that this element of the Enneagram system can be a little bit complicated to understand. It harkens back to some old language from where the Enneagram came from in the first place, old spiritual teachings. For instance, the passions of the Enneagram types are the 7 deadly sins of the Christian tradition, plus fear and deceit. But I think that only, for me, deepens the importance of understanding what the passion is and what the 9 passions are for each of the Enneagram types. Because, like you're saying, it is a central source of our suffering. And although I think sometimes the people can say, well, the Enneagram seems a bit negative, or it's making me feel like there's something wrong with me. Of course, I can understand how people have those responses, but I think what's really important when we work with the Enneagram, and not say a different kind of system that doesn't get as deep to the root of who we are as the Enneagram does, I think part of what the Enneagram helps us do is recognize that at the core of us, when we are identified with a personality, which is not all of who we are, we do suffer because of that. That and the passion is in some ways the root cause of our underlying suffering. It's compulsive. It's something we get overcome by, as in getting overcome by a strong emotion that's triggered from something on the outside, but that we are passive in the face of it, that we suffer because, and to the extent that we are not in touch with, we are not consciously aware of exactly what this passion feels like, looks like, and ends up looking like, especially on the outside when it drives our behavior.
Yeah, great. And while you were speaking, B, I was remembering something that is said in Buddhism. Um, in Buddhism, they say that the source of all suffering is desire, right? And passion in here has to do with a heart's desire. It's like our heart compulsively wants something and believes that unless we get that, we will not be happy. But even when we have it, we are not happy. And that is a compulsion, and that's a trap. So, the idea also, so that we can start understanding what the virtues are, and the virtues are the opposite of the passion here, is that we understand that while we are moved by desire and an uncontrollable desire, we are not there yet. We are being held hostages of this mechanism called personality. Now, the virtue, instead of a desire, it points out to a higher need that we actually have from the perspective of our soul and not from the perspective of this lower heart that we are talking about. Do you agree with this, B? What is your take?
Yes, it's a little bit like getting more and more conscious of what drives the lower heart when we're in personality, and when we're seized by the passion, when it kind of takes us over, we are not ourselves. And one of the things we do when we work with the Enneagram to become more aware of our ego patterns is we're, in essence, studying the way we aren't being who we are. We're being who our personality is. And to the extent that we can become more aware of the passion that drives the personality and kind of takes us over, and makes it so we're not consciously in charge of directing our own lives, we can leave room for working toward its opposite, which is the higher virtue. So almost going from the lower heart
Mhm.
to a higher state of consciousness, or a higher state of the heart.
And this is also something that the Enneagram explains brilliantly. That we all have higher level centers of intelligence, not only the basic centers of intelligence that sometimes are explained also in other models. So, rising above your passion also means being able to have access to higher centers of intelligence that become operative only for people who get to a special place, a special state of being. But I would like to come back to something, because um, I think that people sometimes believe wrongly that the passion of type is necessarily a seeable behavior that the person has, and that's not true. Actually, it's better to understand the passion as a state of the heart. And that means that the heart is, in normal conditions, is in one specific state according to what the passion of your type is. Like for me, as a 5, because the passion of my type is what we call avarice, my heart shuts down. So the disconnection that happens normally for me as a 5 starts in that disconnection happening in my heart. So avarice is a state of the heart disconnecting or being disconnected. And all the behavioral traits come later as a consequence. And maybe sometimes I'm even talking to people or, being there in the world, but my heart is not completely open. So you won't see the behavior of avarice, but the state of the heart is like that.
Well, I think you will see behavior as a result of the state of the heart, right? So these passions, these emotional states do have indirect and direct manifestations in behavior, right? So if I'm in pride, I may say things, I may act in a certain way that's being driven by pride, often in a way that I don't see. So, although exactly like you're saying, the passion isn't necessarily something that's always observable in behavior. Oftentimes, when we're really in the grip of the passion, we are acting it out in ways we don't see, and that can result in certain behavior patterns. Do you agree?
Yeah, exactly. I agree, exactly. Only that because it's almost ever present, it happens also, at least to me, when I'm alone. I can be alone and not be seen or not be doing anything, and still my heart being a little shut down. So, so one thing to understand is the passion is active while you are not having a spiritual experience of true expansion, and not having an amazing different state of being with you right now. So it's almost always there. It's that we haven't been trained to look correctly.
Right. We need to remember that our passion is ever present. It's with us all the time. It's probably almost always active unless you're making a big effort to be present and conscious. And so one of the first things to start doing after you hear this podcast is to start looking at what you're doing, how you're feeling, what's going on inside. And I have to tell you, I actually notice my passion more when I'm by myself than when I'm with other people. Maybe it's being a two, and when I'm with other people, my attention is more on them than it is on my internal process. But when I've really started to see how it's there all the time is when I'm sort of walking along and the things that I think to myself, or the fantasies I have, or the imagination, the sort of episode that shows up in my imagination. Oftentimes that's where I see my pride showing up.
Right, right, right. And B, I don't know what you think, but I have a positive belief that right now, people who are listening to us, they really want to speak more bluntly about things, and they want to hear the truth without much disguise, and people don't want more of the same. So I don't really think we need to hide the fact that the passion is bad, or try to make it look better, or just say that there are good things and bad things about it. I think we need to name that the passion is a problem, is an obstacle, and that our journey with the Enneagram is here to help us move beyond it or rise above it.
I do understand that people are sensitive to getting the message when they learn about the Enneagram that there's something wrong with them, or there's something negative about who they are. And so I do want to speak to that. And I think it makes sense that people are sensitive to that, right? I think most of us are way too self critical, and that's part of our problem. And that's usually, importantly, the personality, not who you are. When you're self critical, when you feel bad about yourself, when you interpret what you hear as being a judgment on who you are, I think it's understandable. But we want to be really, really clear here. The passion is not a good thing. But that it doesn't mean that you're not essentially good. On the contrary, what's not good is when we are so identified with our ego, and the ego wants to keep itself alive, wants to stay in charge, but the ego actually blocks you from being all of who you can be. So, what we're talking about here is not a good thing, but it doesn't mean that you're not good. And it doesn't mean that we're judging. It means that we're naming in a very honest way the activity of the ego that we need to be very clear about naming so that we can observe it and eventually reduce it and express more of all the goodness that's inside of us, because we're not blocking ourselves through these unconscious habits associated with the lower self or the ego or the personality, which is kind of a mask. It masks the persona, is something that hides our goodness, because it's just oriented to survival.
Yes, B, yes. And I think we also need to make clear that the state of relaxing down the passion and experiencing the virtue is achievable. It's not a theory, it's not an abstraction, it is achievable. And we see it all the time with so many people, so many students that we have. And so it's not something just out of our imagination or a theory. Whenever we do deeper inner work using the Enneagram becomes this wonderful shortcut to be able to transform the passion and convert it into the virtue. And it's important maybe to understand that the passion is operating on the lower heart, like this heart is on the left hand side inside our chest, while the virtue is connected through what we call the spiritual heart, which is another structure that can be studied, explained. It's not for us to talk about it here, but it's a big shift. You're not in touch with as much pain when you are in touch with your virtue. You are reconnecting more fully with your soul and with so much potential coming from the universal heart. So the message of the Enneagram is this. It's like the Enneagram exists because of this kind of work. And when it gets reduced to a typology that explains 9 personality types only, then we lose its main meaning.
Yes, and some authors and talk about how being in personality is really, well, it's a degradation of consciousness. All the spiritual traditions teach us there's a kind of fall before we come into a human life. We are connected with the virtues, so adopting a personality as a survival strategy in life is a way of losing touch with the virtue and then replacing it by the passion. And so when we do inner work, or when we use the Enneagram for self development in a deep way, which is exactly what it's designed for, it's all about becoming aware of the passion, the substitute, the less deep thing that we are focused on that really just drives us around in circles in our life to the extent that it takes us over and becomes compulsive, so that we can bit by bit, step by step, disidentify with that passion and the personality patterns that it drives, and leave more and more room for working more and more toward embodying the higher virtue. And it's, to me, it's beautiful that within each Enneagram type, there is this, and I like the way you call it, a paradox between the passion we identify with when we're in personality that drives us, that fuels our behavior much of the time, and how its exact opposite is this higher virtue. And I remember when I was in my early Enneagram training, it was called the vice to virtue conversion. Now, again, don't get too hung up on the word vice or the word sin. I think if we take these deeper meanings of them, it means missing the mark. It means there is something wrong in that you aren't as fully conscious as you could be. You aren't embodying your higher self as much as is possible for you after you do inner work. So when we can understand and study and get more and more and more conscious of how our passion operates, we automatically start making this beautiful journey toward its opposite, which is the higher virtue. And the more we focus on that, the more we bring that into our life, the more we move away from compulsive habits and being stuck in identifying with something that isn't really who we are, to moving more and more into a fuller and fuller recognition, realization of who we can be, of our higher self.
Right, right. And we are also not saying that we need to simply get rid of the passion. It's important first to own that the passion is there and has always been there, prevailing more than any other thing, perhaps. And so looking at it, observing that it is in there, and understanding all the possible manifestations of it, because there are uh, multiple indirect manifestations of the passion that we don't always call by the right name, by the passion's name. So we need to learn how to observe it all the way. And then we need to start doing the purging process of getting frustrated with that passion. Again, not with us, but with it. Differentiating from it already, disidentifying from it. And there are steps in that frustration. We teach them, but we're not going to go through those steps today, maybe on another podcast. But the thing is, we need to really know that if we are not in touch with the passion, and if we don't work from within that passion to feel frustrated about it, we will never disconnect fully from it. And therefore, we will miss that brilliant opportunity of experience our virtue.
Yes, and this might be a good moment to talk a little bit about Dante's Divine Comedy. For me, it's such a great illustration of exactly what we're talking about. When I learned the Enneagram and I learned about the passions, again, it's a little bit confusing. It does come from these very old traditions, which in my mind actually makes them the whole passion and virtue teaching even more deep and meaningful. But when I saw in Purgatory, in Dante's Divine Comedy, how the purging of the passion and the working toward the opposite, the higher virtue, is depicted in the action of the purgatory so clearly, it really helped me understand a lot about the meaning, the very profound meaning of exactly what we're talking about in terms of this growth opportunity embedded in the Enneagram from going from recognizing the heart of how you stay unconscious in a way in your heart to the higher heart, to something that automatically draws you upward. So I'll say a little bit about how this is shown to be true in Dante. And that is, a lot of us have read the Inferno. We understand that in Dante's Divine Comedy, which again is 700 years old, so it has timeless value for us, I think. In the Inferno, all the sins are there, all the Enneagram passions are in there. And it basically is about how when we're totally identified with our passion, which are these seven deadly sins plus fear and deceit, in essence, we're stuck in something that's unpleasant, that doesn't really do anything good for us forever. We're kind of going around and around in circles. So it's really interesting that in Dante's Hell, the punishment is the sin itself. It is the passion. It is being stuck in our automatic patterns. We just do it forever, which is a little bit like our lives before we discover something like the Enneagram and work on becoming more conscious of what keeps us stuck. But then in the purgatory, it's a mountain and there are terraces. And on each terrace, a different passion is purged or worked off or worked out of. They do things together in groups to release the passion, to purge it, to get rid of it. And they also work toward the exact opposite, the higher virtue. So, for instance, the first terrace of purgatory, and again, it's a mountain, so you are going up the more work you do. And the first terrace is humility. And on the terrace of humility, the souls there purge the passion of pride. Now, everybody has to purge pride, interestingly. Everybody purges all the passions. But depending on what your main issue was in life, you will have to spend more time on that terrace than all the other terraces. So in a way, it mirrors exactly what we teach with the Enneagram, is there are these 9 passions. We may participate a little bit in more than one, but there's really only one that we really need to work on in a very important, deep way, because it's our main problem in essence. And so he talks about how, for instance, one person would have to spend 50 years on the terrace of humility, but maybe only a couple years on all the other terraces. And that person might have been a 2, because pride is the passion of 2 and humility is the higher virtue. And what will happen on each terrace is they're doing something. Like on the terrace of pride, all the souls there are carrying these giant stones on their back, which is all about putting their noses to the ground. So they're bent over walking, and as they walk, they're seeing stories about pride on the ground that are etched into the ground. So they're learning about stories about pride. They're carrying these big stones, all to purge this habit of pride, and as a way of releasing it, so that they can be more in a state of humility. And then on the next terrace, it's about envy. And so if you spend a lot of time on the terrace of envy, you might be a 4. And there's ways of purging the passion of envy. And on that terrace, the souls have their eyelids stitched shut with iron wire, so that they can't look at other people and compare themselves. They're also wearing very plain clothing. They're wearing sacks, and the 4s listening can know how painful that might be. So they're purging the passion of envy, and they're going toward, in Dante's scheme, generosity. In the Enneagram, it would be equanimity. So they're rising above and in going, putting their heart in this higher state that opposes envy. And in this way, Dante, in a beautiful way, really kind of highlights what we need to do when we are really moving away from, through being more conscious, through doing things that oppose it, the passion that grips us most of the time.
Brilliant. The virtue is always the very opposite of the passion. It's almost the flip side of the coin. When we fall down, which happens archetypally for all of us, as it should, we build ego in a way that we end up being in the very opposite of what our soul wants to express. And that means that we go to the opposite of the virtue, and the passion is that opposite. Now, when we realize that and start doing specific work, and as you said while explaining about Dante, focusing a bit more on our passion, or a lot more on our passion than on the other ones, simply because we don't have all the time we need in a lifetime to do all this work, then we start creating a good positive split in the inside. We start to open up space, at the very least, for the virtue. And in the inside, we start to experience a paradox. Like for you as a Jew, pride will be there, but at times you will really feel drawn to be humble and to be in humility and to be less important or less relevant. And I will have avarice, but at times I will also feel something opposite to avarice, which is a lot of energy and willingness to keep connected in all possible ways to people, and that is the state of the paradox in the inside. I've been identified with that passion, but now I'm feeling something very different. And more I see that I'm not that passion, and sometimes I can even feel who I am actually, when in touch with that virtue, but I'm not yet capable to stay there, and I fall back down on the passion state. So I'm in between, and it's paradoxical. So clearly, we're not as obvious as before, not as easy to define. Some people even mistake that state of paradox um, with being of another Enneagram type, as if they were changing type or if they were wrong before. But it's only that they are individuating, like Jung would say. They are growing and they are achieving higher levels of awareness within their types. And this is because we don't change type, but we change. And some other time we'll talk about levels of awareness here on Enneagram 2.0 podcast. Now, the virtue is is a beautiful manifestation of who we are when in touch with our souls and in touch with our spiritual heart. It's not felt as anything similar to a lower emotion as we are used to. It really felt as a blessed thing, and we're talking about higher level emotions here, just as we could mention gratitude, forgiveness, and other higher level emotions, and goodness itself also. But each type reconnects back first to all those, that realm of higher level emotions, through one specific virtue that has been lost in the end of that falling down process. And therefore, we have become more sensitive towards it. Meaning that when we go up and we are about to have higher level experiences, we will reconnect to that particular virtue first. And through it, we are going to reconnect to all nine virtues, right? But the virtue of our type is in itself the uh, absolute opposite of what the passion of our type is. And it's good then to understand the virtue as an antidote for the passion. It's the thing that burns the passion down, and it's end of career for the passion. The problem is that we can have experiences of the virtue without being able to stay in them, and then we fall back down. It takes time, discipline, and the right methods to be able to be in touch with the virtue and stay in touch with it, so that we will be taming the passion more. But having a first experience of the virtue is already very meaningful.
Let's do a short break.
The Enneagram 2.0 podcast goes live every other Thursday on all main platforms. Stay tuned to learn more about yourself and others.
Bee and Uranio offer much more high-quality Enneagram content on www.cpenneagram.com. If you are an Enneagram enthusiast, visit the website now, www.cpenneagram.com.
So the passion of type 8 is lust. Lust is a passion for excess. It's a kind of making everything they do more excessive. It's a passion for excess and intensity in all stimulation. It's a drive to fill up an inner emptiness, which most of these passions are, through physical gratification of some kind or another. Now, sometimes people think about this passionateness or this intensity as only coming through sex. That's what lust is often thought of as referring to. However, and I really actually appreciate the esoteric meanings behind some of the Enneagram language. And again, I think it invites us to really engage in our inner work a little bit and not get too lazy around not doing the work of really understanding what this really important experience is. Lust is a kind of passion for making everything more expanded, for getting more of something. And again, usually it's a more intense experience. It's often physical, as eights are body types.
I think for all passions, it's very important we mention a few examples among many we could mention of indirect manifestations of it, so that people see how the passion is ever present. So lust for eights is behind the reason why eights get close to you when talking to you or have intense eye contact. It's all boosted by that energy of lust or excess, or expanding the energy beyond the body when approaching someone in ways that are energetically felt as being threatening by the other person, by the way, or provoking people, rebelling against the rules. It's all fueled by lust. When writing, using adverbs of intensity, capital letters, or when talking, loud voice, being direct in the communication, power disputes, and so on. So all of that is lust. So we need to name those things as lust. Now, when we go to a higher level as eights, if you are an eight and you go to a higher level and get to experience the virtue of innocence, well, that is felt as the opposite of how you feel the passion of lust. Innocence is responding in a fresh, brand new way to each moment, to whatever is happening here and now, without judgment, memory, expectation, and without defending yourself. You're simply open to what is happening here and now. You're vulnerable to being in the moment. And in innocence, you don't provoke, you don't react. By the way, the state of innocence is the state of non-reactivity. Okay. And this is what we see all the time. And just by talking about this, I remember of so many eight students of ours who do beautiful work. We see all the time in eights that are in a good place, right? They are very soft. They're very aware of the impact they have on other people.
I think when you see an 8 in innocence, you just really see their sensitivity. It's just obvious. It's very apparent in the things they do and just in their presence. And I think that's, to me, the essence of the high side of 8. So now let's talk about type 9. The passion here is, in the old language, it's sloth. Sometimes we update that to say laziness. And the definition, again, I think it's good actually to engage with these definitions and work at understanding what they mean in the meaning of the depth of the Enneagram teaching. And this laziness is a kind of psycho-spiritual laziness. Most nines that you probably know in your life, if you're a 9, you're very active. You're busy. You do a lot. It's not that you're lazy in the typical meaning of the word. It's a laziness with respect to being in touch with your own sense of being. It's a kind of psycho-spiritual laziness with being awake to yourself. 9s can often work so hard on behalf of other people or on behalf of the group or the family. But for themselves, it's like they lose energy. It's like they go blind to their own importance. And this is sloth. So rather than a reluctance to take action, this passion is more about an inattention to self and an inertia of the will when it comes to tuning in to what's going on internally at a deeper level.
I love when we say that sloth is not lack of action. It's all possible action, but the right one. And the right action is the virtue, right? But before we go there, some of the indirect manifestations of sloth are being overly calm, or becoming the mediator, empathetic, selfless, understanding person, which is self-forgetting. It's in itself, although it may look good in the outside, it's not healthy from a self-development perspective. Losing objectivity, listen too much to other people's opinions before saying one's own, even stubbornness, sinking energy down in the body, it has all to do with sloth, right? And then when nines go to the higher emotional center and connect or reconnect to the virtue of right action, nines become really, really dynamic, focused in this one thing that needs to be done. First of all, they know what it is. And it doesn't matter at all if this will mean confronting people or not, or if people will be happy with them or not. They just go and do it because there is full commitment of the heart to doing what's needed. And it's usually something about themselves because they've been self-forgetting, but sometimes it's also something that is stuck in any given process in a way that they become the revolutionaries around, the ones that make things work again in a new way. It's like essential movement, total emotional engagement with that movement, because I finally become willing to do what's needed. And I see it with my heart and I move using my heart. So right action is in the heart because it's a heart's capacity of not only seeing, but committing to what needs to be done and nobody else is doing.
I love seeing nines when they're in right action because it's as if they take all the energy, and nines have a lot of energy, but they disperse it. They kind of send it out there, they give it away to other people. And it's almost as if when they're in right action, they collect back all the energy they dispersed outside and they bring it into themselves and act in this very powerful way. Let's talk about the passion of ones, which is anger. Now, anger as an emotional passion in one occurs in its repressed form. So it's almost like the anger of ones gets channeled into trying to do the right thing, trying to make everything better, trying to improve themselves and the world. Ones display hostility toward what's imperfect, the imperfect way things are, and try to force things to conform to their ideal of how things should be. So the anger can not always look like what we think of as anger. It's more the anger that leaks out in one's behavior through tension in the body, through tamped down forms of anger, which would be annoyance, irritation, self-righteousness. These are sometimes the ways the passion of anger shows up for ones. And of course, for all of us, it's really healthy to get in touch with the passion to make it more conscious. And when ones can do this, it's very good for them.
Some other indirect manifestations can be the normal tension that you see, ones holding on their bodies, like shoulders, jaws, eyelids, forehead, lips, hands, or the critical or penetrating gaze. Actually, both the critic and the inner critic come from anger. They are very angry, the critic and the inner critic inside, ones, and being judging, criticizing, and just being irritated or looking irritated. It's all anger. Now, when ones grow and they get to the state of serenity, which is the virtue for ones, they are absolutely the opposite, the perfect opposite of all that. They are extremely calm, emotionally calm, and their bodies are totally relaxed in themselves and receptive to abundance of energy in what spirit traditions call the Hara point or the Dantian. And serenity here is not a mental attitude at all. It's more like allowing life force to be expressed in themselves fully, and allowing it to become a smile or a laughter or just some impulse for pleasure. And the person then is not so much self-contained as ones tend to be in personality. When in touch with serenity, ones are truly more free to do what they need to do. And if they are in touch with serenity, there's a rule: nothing that they will do will be harmful for others or for themselves. because it's impossible that a virtue is based on bad things. It is always based in goodness. It's something about the nature of all nine virtues. So one can finally relax and just be. And it's amazing when we see students, which happens quite often at retreats, being like that. They are totally relaxed, inspiring, and they look like they become 10 years younger right away. It's wonderful. What about your type B, type 2?
Yes, twos. So this is a tricky one. I'll warn you ahead of time. So pride, in the language of the Enneagram, functions as a need, an unconscious need for self-elevation, and gets expressed as a kind of false generosity in the service of seduction and self-elevation. So it's behind the need to be important to people. Pride also fuels a pattern of self-idealization, almost like seeing yourself a little bit better than you actually are, and grandiosity, seeing yourself as big and important. But also, it can be followed by a reactive devaluation and deflation. So I like to point to this because sometimes twos have a hard time really fully understanding what pride is. And this is part of the trickiness of pride. So pride, in an interesting way, is also synonymous with a good thing, right? Like you're proud of your child or you're proud of an accomplishment. But we're not talking about this in a positive sense at all. Pride for twos is this kind of need to be important, this self-elevation. And it's often hard to see because it can seem the same as confidence. It's basically saying you're in control of everything. The sin of Satan was to say I in the face of the only one. So he tried to put himself on the same level as God. And as an angel, he, by definition, was not on the same level. And that is why he fell to a very low place. And so it's important for us to be humble. Humility, is we'll hear about in a moment, is the higher virtue. And that means not needing to see yourself as more important than you are. When we assume that everyone should like us, when we have a drive to make everyone like us, when we do things for people, thinking we can meet all the needs in the world, not being aware of our own needs, these are all ways that we tend to be unaware of pride and the way pride operates.
Well, it makes a lot of sense. Now, what I would add is just one point. I think Jews can spot pride more easily when they look for how they feel excessively glad when they feel useful or needed. It's not about feeling glad, it's about feeling excessively glad. It's like I feel very happy when I help someone and the person thanks me. So I hear from Chu sometimes that makes their day or their week, and this is the issue. The word very, the adverb of intensity here is the problem. Now, the virtue of humility, it's always the opposite of the passion. And humility is self-acceptance of our own limitations. And as human beings, we're totally limited, right? From childhood, from babyhood, we can't survive without our mothers. We're the only animal species that can't. So we're very limited. And accepting those limitations, both in the body level and in the bigger level, is humility. So, there is this spiritual teaching from many traditions that says, you are no one. You are no one, right? So this is something that can't be felt unless you are in touch with the virtue of humility. We have um, beliefs about how important we are that are not real. Beliefs in our individual powers, beliefs that we are making all these things happen, that we are running the show. And in humility, we know that we are no one. And so it's like I downgrade myself to a place of not as much centrality for things to happen. And I allow myself to feel the relief of that. And I don't need to be the most important person for in those people's lives. I don't need to be there for them all the time, of having the solution for the problems all the time. And I have my own problems and I have my own needs. And sometimes I'm simply tired. Simple things like this can be acknowledged and expressed only when we are humble. And humility is all of that for a true and much more.
Yes, for me, humility is knowing exactly how important I am and not making myself more or less. As a self preservation, too, I can tend to make myself less more often. Uh, but of course, I also make myself more, especially in my own head. Okay, so let's move on to 3. The original passion for type 3 is deceit, or more accurately, self deceit, where they're actually in some sense, lying to themselves about who they are because they over identify with their persona, with their personality, and also whatever image they need to turn themselves into in the moment to appear successful, to get people to admire them, and to kind of to feel okay in the world, to feel worthy of love. It's like 3s feel like they have to earn it by identifying with what's valued and turning themselves into that. So self-deceit is a kind of shape-shifting. It's a identification of what people see as valuable or admirable, and then automatically, with no thinking involved, just automatically, it's this state of the heart of turning yourself into whatever is valued from the inside, such that you can appear like a chameleon or shapeshift into different forms based on what is going to help you connect with your audience the most. So this is the kind of self-deceit that is the passion of the type 3. So what would you add to that?
Yeah, I really like that you explained self-deceit as being the shape-shifting tendency itself. I think this is essential to understand, and therefore to understand that the shape-shifting that threes do is perhaps the most important thing to observe in personality. Now, that self-deceit also happens in very indirect ways, like when threes take in other people's feelings or objectives in life. They are in self-deceit when they are converting themselves into that other person. They are not that person, and they live a life of just being different depending on where they are and who they are talking to. So that also shows up when threes adapt their language to talk to different people, different groups of friends, or they dress differently depending on where they go, or the kind of goals and challenges they undertake and how they go for them, how they behave, the things they say they value. So everything gets determined by that self-deceit. Self-deceit is simply not being in touch with who I am, having become the prototype of what each person wants me to be. While veracity, which is the virtue for threes, is being nothing but who I am, being nothing else, and regardless of what people will think of me. If you are a three, you need to know you are emotional. And in touch with veracity, you'll stop lying to yourself and the world as if you were not emotional. So veracity has to do with being who you are, and that includes being emotional. There is a willingness in the inside of never lying, never being fake. So in personality, it's a pity that that's not what we see. But when threes are in touch with the virtue of veracity, there is nothing in their hearts that wishes to be fake. And it's amazing and inspiring to see that.
Okay, beautiful. Let's move on to type 4. For type 4, the passion is envy. And envy in 4s manifests as a painful sense of lack and a craving toward that which is seen as lacking or felt as lacking. For 4s, envy grows out of a sense of loss that leads to a perception that something good is outside the 4's experience. Something good is outside of themselves, and that this something is necessary but missing because of some sort of inner deficiency on their part. So it's the habit of comparing themselves to others and the feeling that derives from that ongoing comparison that either puts them below or sometimes above, but often at a deeper level, it gives them this inner sense of inferiority that comes from looking out into the world and discerning that they have less or are missing something good that other people have.
I think that many fours avoid saying that some of the main traits of the four personality come from envy, because envy is sort of seen as a less beautiful word. But it's very useful for the inner work of force to name many things as envy. And let me say a few more. So both feeling inferior or superior is envy. You can't feel inferior or superior unless you're comparing yourself to someone else. And comparison is envy. And when you compare and you complain about the person, or when you disdain someone, or you become harsh with the person, that's envy, because you are seeing how you are superior. Now, if you admire that person a lot, that's also envy potentially, because you're looking at the person as if the person was above you, right? Idealizing the person, and in the inside, you may be developing that energy in your heart of wanting to be that person. Now, the virtue for force is brilliant. It's called equanimity. Equanimity in here has to do with balance, but it's balance in different ways. It's first of all balance of how I see myself and others. It's a new way to feel who I am in front of others that make me feel we are equals. So this is equanimity. Another way equanimity is balanced is that force become really non-emotional, more neutral in the heart, and they stop comparing, and everything is simpler. And they actually, at this point, want to go for what's simple, not for what is different or sophisticated. Even their movements are economical, or the way they dress, the way they speak. They become more harmonious with everything. And that has to do with equanimity. It's also calmness of the heart. And this person is not affected by external stimuli. And they respond to these things exactly as much as necessary. So it's a totally different thing you see from a four when they get in touch with this higher side of being called equanimity.
That's very clear. Let's do a short break.
Hello, it's me, Uranio. Just to tell you that BNI launched a new online workshop called the Enneagram Masterclass. It's a 6-hour video course that you can access at cpenneagram.com. You can go at your own pace and have lifetime access to it. Many beginner students have already watched it, but advanced students can also learn about the 9 types in a deeper way. We can't wait for you to check it out. Get $75 off your purchase by using code ChestnutPaes75 on cpenneagram.com.
Bea and Uranio offer much more high-quality Enneagram content on www.cpenneagram.com. If you are an Enneagram enthusiast, visit the website now, www.cpenneagram.com.
So I'll move on to type 5. The passion here is avarice. So I'll define it, and then maybe you can expand on it from your own internal experience of avarice. Avarice is a holding back and holding in. It's the hoarding of time and space and resources out of a fear of impending impoverishment. It's not so much greediness as it is a retentiveness, a drive to hold on to what they already have and be economical with what they have, rather than a drive to acquire more. So it's a kind of withholding out of a fear of depletion. Can you expand on that for us?
Sure. I think a simpler way to understand avarice is just by understanding that in avarice, the heart shuts down, both for receiving and for giving. It's like staying with oneself. It's like a heart that closes the doors and the windows, you know. And avarice this way becomes lack of intensity, a movement against any abundance and against any feeling, because feelings tend to be something that open the heart back, right? And avarice has an agenda of shutting the heart down. So emotions are not welcome from the avarice's perspective. And then there is this compulsion towards hoarding knowledge and knowing things just as a means to not be in touch with the poverty felt in the heart. And an incapacity to feel what others are feeling, to give or receive whatever, care, love, any other thing. Even having a neutral language and not expressing emotions is avarice in itself. It's an indirect manifestation. Everything that tends to be neutral or controlled exists because the heart is not completely open. And it's scary. While I open my heart, the more I open my heart, the less I see my old self-control inability. And it's scary, but it seems it's the path forward. Now, the virtue for fives is called non-attachment, and we use this word instead of detachment because detachment can be a bit confusing. So non-attachment is when the heart is not attached to what is already inside it. No previous content. So it opens the doors to let all that go and opens the doors to allow everything new to come in. It becomes open, both for inputs and outputs. And then this non-attachment doesn't choose what is going to come inside and what is going to go outside. There is no self-control. So in non-attachment, fives become in sync with all life flow, all life force. It feels like all the energy of nature is coming inside the heart and flowing outside it because there is no need to hoard. And fives this way become very intense and very connected. It feels like an interconnectedness with all there is, things and people.
So moving on to type 6. And most of us probably understand what fear is. I was surprised to learn when I was first studying the Enneagram that many sixes reported that before they learned the Enneagram, they didn't label what they experienced as fear. So even though many of us who aren't sixes might think, oh, well, how could fear be very unconscious? Well, in sixes, they often describe it as, like all the rest of the passions, something that can be quite unconscious. So fear is an unpleasant emotional and physiological response to recognize sources of danger. And this is important. It usually goes hand in hand with anxiety, which can be more or less conscious depending on subtype. But the anxiety includes apprehension, tension, or uneasiness related to the anticipation of danger, the source of which is unknown or unrecognized, or may originate even inside one's own mind. Anything you would add to that?
Yeah, I think that fear needs to be seen in very simple things. Like whenever a six goes to a public place and there are people around and they start unconsciously trying to listen what they are talking about or to see what they are doing. It's all coming from fear. Like paying attention to whatever is happening in the ray of 2 or 3 meters or 9 or 10 feet from me, So apart from this, uh, accelerating your thoughts or your conclusions because of anxiety can come out of fear, or avoiding decisions or making decisions too early. Whatever is coming from anxiety is fear. I really like to see anxiety this way as being like fear's brother or sister. It's like they are almost the same. And also the communication pattern of saying it depends, what if, it comes from fear. It's like I procrastinate. I don't move myself owning my own authority, right? Now, the virtue of sixes is the opposite of fear, and it's called courage. So courage needs to be understood as not exactly the absence of fear, but the capacity of going ahead despite fear. It's like, uh, you know, owning your fear and doing the next move, going ahead and having your next step. That next step is courage itself. And doing inner work is a courageous act, like looking at your fear, seeing that you are projecting, for instance, and saying, here I am, I'll take full responsibility of this, and I'll go ahead, and I'll do it differently, and then I go. It's like I don't delegate my power to anyone else. I don't seek for a strong authority, or I don't get stuck with an authority I don't believe in. I own my own authority. I cease to be avoiding of my power. And I become the leader of my own life. And I revolutionize it if needed. So the virtue of courage has to do also with going ahead and doing things with your heart open, not shutting down your heart.
Okay, so moving on to type 7, the passion of type 7 is gluttony. Now, we commonly think of gluttony as connected to food and drink and indulging too much. But in the Enneagram understanding, it's an excessive indulgence in consuming whatever brings pleasure. And we're often asked, what's the difference between gluttony and lust? Well, it's not so much an immersion in a pleasurable experience like lust is. Gluttony, rather, is a desire to taste a little bit of everything, to sample uh, uh, as many of a variety of things without being limited, as opposed to deeply experiencing them. So it's like it's sort of more consuming a little bit of everything rather than fully digesting or fully uh, taking in more and more and more to a deep level. And inevitably, of course, this leads to dissatisfaction and a sense of insufficiency. But then that gets masked by the pursuit of more experience, more pleasurable experience, more trying a little bit of everything. So it's more of a variety rather than a depth. Would you add anything to clarify that?
I think we can see gluttony when, if you are 7, you can see it when you're trying not to miss out on any possibilities, when you develop different interests at a time, when you multitask, when you jump from one activity to another, when the first one becomes a little less interesting or the other one becomes more interesting. Sometimes not finishing up ideas and projects. Also, leaving conclusions open, for instance, is a sign of gluttony, because you don't want to miss out on any opportunity, right? Or feeling amazed, thrilled, energized, excited. I know it feels good, but it's coming from gluttony. Now, when 7s do the work and get in touch with the virtue of sobriety, they don't feel that. What they feel is the opposite. They want less. They become automatically more serious. Now, watch out, because from the 7's personality or from gluttony, this sounds horrible. But when 7s are really in touch with sobriety, this virtue, they love it. And it feels to them that they are truly being joyful for the first time in their lives. It's not only about being happy, but it's more about being joyful. And it's not about desires and pleasures. It's about fulfilling your heart. Now, in sobriety, 7s do one thing at a time. They don't want to do two things. They go to the end. Therefore, they have a beautiful focus that help them out in their lives or careers. And they are rooted in the moment, grounded, and they're present. And they absorb nothing more or nothing less than what they need. And they don't waste energy. They don't disperse their energy in things out there. They are in touch with themselves, in touch with what's happening here and now, and they are sober. And they are not doing anything to get distracted from that moment. It's brilliant, very inspiring to see a 7 like that.
Yes, it's when they can focus. It's when they can sink more deeply into the present moment and really experience, which I think, like you're saying, can be a big relief once they get it. Because gluttony is it can be directed to different things, but when they're in sobriety, it's a real almost coming home to a deeper part of themselves.
It's time for our top 5 today. What is our top 5 today, Bea?
The top 5 today is the 5 types most likely to do inner work. And we were thinking the top 5 most likely to be attracted to doing inner work and to be most diligent about it. Starting with number 5. And I have to say, one factor I was thinking about when I was figuring out what my 5 were was the types that we tend to see coming to our inner work retreats a lot and the types we don't. I have to say that was one factor, not the whole thing, but there are certain types we get a lot of, and our inner work retreats are very deep. It's not for everyone. It's for people who are really ready to face themselves and really leverage the Enneagram in the way it was meant to be leveraged, as a deep inner work tool. So anyway, my number 5 is 2s. Now, I was a little bit torn on 2s because on the one hand, I think we get a lot of 2s, not every time, but we do get a lot of 2s, and we see a lot of 2s engaging in inner work. We see a lot of 2s engaging in inner work. And certainly when I was a psychotherapist, I had a lot of 2 clients. So I think one reason why 2s come to the inner work is when they experience problems in relationships, it's very difficult because relationships tend to be at the center of their lives and the center of their experience. So I think we do get a lot of 2s, and 2s generally really are motivated to work on themselves. But I also think that some 2s don't come to inner work. They don't really do the self-development effort because of the pride. I think pride can sometimes make the 2 believe there's no problem here.
So, yes. So, I first want to say that I actually don't see a big difference between all the 9 types when it comes to which one does more inner work. After 20 plus years, I don't think that there is so much difference than I used to think. But it's true that sometimes come more to specific retreats, others go to other kinds of inner work opportunities. I think it's tricky. I think that what differentiates the most, what makes people come to do inner work, it's not actually type. It's life circumstances and callings people have, and that happens to everybody. However, I think there are differences. So my 5th is 1, type 1. I've had many 1 students in the past in sort of in-depth workshops. And I think that many times 1s come to workshops because in the beginning they think it's an opportunity for improvement, and that attracts them. So self-development, I need to self-develop, but they don't really know that what we tell them when they arrive, right? Which is, if you're a 1, you need to become worse, right? So
you need to stop all the self-development. You need to stop all the self-development. You're doing it too much already every day.
Yeah, and it's more about allowing yourself to live life more freely, Now, so this is my 5th. What is your 4th, B?
My 4th is 5s. And this is because I see a similar thing to 2s, that there's some things that bring 5s to the work. You often see them in certain settings, but some things that don't. Sometimes when I've done Enneagram panels where I have 5s talking about their inner work and their experience, I notice that sometimes 5s have the sense that everything's kind of okay. They've created certain boundaries in their lives. They have certain routines and ways that they, control what's happening. And so there's no real problem. Sometimes they aren't in touch with the deeper sense of the pain of disconnection. Let's put it that way. On the other hand, I think a lot of 5s, especially when they learn the Enneagram, get very interested in the Enneagram system itself and also the inner work that it points to. And so I think also there are 5s that do get in touch with the pain of not engaging fully with life. And I think those 5s get very motivated. But we don't see as many 5s in our workshops. And certainly maybe it's also an intimidating factor around doing inner work in a group of people. So there could be that element of that as well. So that's my number 4.
Yeah, I ended up not having 5s among my top 5 here today. But my 4th is choose. So I basically agree with all you said. I think that sometimes choose come to inner work thinking that they can better understand the partner or the friend or the son or the daughter, and they end up then seeing things inside themselves. But I do see that many choose come to this work. So what is your 3rd, B?
My 3rd is 9s. And I think 9s do come to the inner work quite a lot. I see them getting interested, even in organizations. When I've worked in organizations, they express a lot of interest in the Enneagram and knowing themselves at a deeper level. I think sometimes what happens with 9s is they wake up at one point a bit and recognize that they're not fully connected to themselves, and that doesn't feel right. It can look like not being in a relationship that's not working, that they can't really find their way out of. It can look like being stuck in a career that they really didn't choose. It can feel like not being fully alive. And so I do find we get a lot of 9s that come to our retreats and that are very interested in accessing their own power more, acting on their own behalf, getting in touch with their own agenda. So 9s are my number 3.
My number 3 is 6s. I always see many 6s doing this work. I think that they sometimes come first because they think there is something wrong with them. And they are curious also. And I simply see a lot of 6s. I'm not sure I understand totally the reasons why some types might be more attracted to inner work, but I just see that 6s stick with this somehow. And my hypothesis is that 6s are inherently stronger to do the difficult parts of inner work. Now, what is your second?
Well, my second is 6s. And I agree with what you said. I definitely think that in some ways 6s experience some of the pain of being in personality more than other types might, where their personality kind of solves the problems as opposed to creating problems. Whereas for 6s, I think, being fearful can be a difficult experience. And to the extent that they're in touch with their fear or the activity, the overactivity, the over responsibility that fear drives in them, they can be a bit more in touch with the need to make a change. I also think an important thing about 6s is they tend to be humble. They tend to be more self-deprecating. I think some of the types that can be a little bit more in pride or a little bit more of an elevated mood or sense of themselves sometimes don't come as much to the inner work because they can create a kind of positive feeling or a kind of a little bit of a unconscious grandiosity. Whereas 6s, I think, tend to side with the underdog. They tend to not see themselves as so their self-image isn't so puffed up that doing self-development work doesn't poke that too much. In other words, they're already humble. They don't necessarily resist being humbled by the experience of doing the hard work of self-development.
Interesting. Yeah, my second is 9. So we inverted, right? Your third is my second is your third. So 9s, in my view, not only all you said, which I agree with, but I think that 9s have this mechanism of, yeah, I'm in and I'll join, I'll be with all of you guys, and they just want to be part of, and they give it a try. To many other things, not only inner work, but then I also think there is this instinctive piece that it's like a calling. It's like I think this is something I need to do, and they go ahead and register at a retreat, and what I'm curious, I think our number 1 will be the same, but which one is yours?
Yes, I think so too. And one more thing I want to say about 9s is similar to 6s, they tend to be more humble when they're in personality, and that could be another thing. So 4s is my number 1. And I think 4s really engage in self-development work a lot. Certainly when I was a psychotherapist, I had a lot of 4 clients, and I always experienced them as fully engaged in their process of development. I think that 4s are motivated to come because oftentimes they are in touch with the pain of being in personality and all the limitations that brings. They don't hide from the pain of just being in a personality as much as other types might. Also, they, similar to 2s, if they are experiencing difficulty in connecting with others or in relationships, often that can stimulate them to want to do inner work. And I also just think they tend to be very aware of and engaged in their internal processes. They tend to be people who are very just deeply interested in understanding people generally, but especially what's going on inside them. Very engaged with their own emotional territory, with their own ups and downs, and wanting to have some sort of relief from what can sometimes be an extremely painful experience of inner deficiency. So for all of these many reasons, I see fours as being very likely and to come to inner work and doing diligent work when they do.
So yeah, fours is also my first, my number one. And to add to all that you've already explained, I want to say that to me, point 4 is the point of the seeker on the Enneagram. That's what I feel, what I sense. And this is because, the energy of force is the energy of never, ever being okay with what we are already living. There's something else to go try to find. We need to move on. And there is existential questioning, and we're not happy with the current state of things. And the 4 in each of us is willing, therefore, to investigate and to do existential work, right? And last thing about this, I believe that 4s are attracted to depth and to anything that's deep. And inner work is definitely deep and sometimes difficult. So this is why I have 4s in my number 1 list.
Okay, so that's our top 5 for this week. And we thank you for listening. And please join us again for our Enneagram 2.0 podcast, where we talk about all things Enneagram.
Please click on like to help spread the word about our podcast.